Berlin Wall. Chancellor Kohl tells all Berliners, "We are one nation." And the people continue their wild celebrations. Good morning, you're watching Sky World News Overnight on Saturday, November the 11th. I'm Stephen Marnie. The Berlin Wall, so long a symbol of the division between capitalism and communism, is being pulled down this morning. East Germany last night began bulldozing new openings in the wall, the first of a planned 18 new border crossings. East and West Berlin are awash with people celebrating a day of momentous changes. At a huge party rally, East German leader Egon Krenz said a lesson had been learnt that we won't forget. The hope now, he said, is people will come back if they're given the freedom to travel. In West Berlin, Chancellor Kohl told 20,000 people, "We are and we will remain one nation."
In an emotional speech, Chancellor Helmut Kohl was to tell the huge crowd gathered below him, "We are and will remain one nation." Joined on the platform by his Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher and the Mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, Kohl spoke of the right of all Germans to unity, justice and freedom. At the same time, East German leader Egon Krenz addressed a tumultuous rally in East Berlin, telling them their leadership had learned a major lesson they wouldn't forget. He appeared at the city centre gathering after his Central Committee had unveiled a package of proposed reforms which include free elections, economic changes and parliamentary control over the feared security forces. Krenz, who's only been in office for 3 weeks, has taken an unparalleled gamble by throwing open the wall which was built just 28 years ago. Work on the dismantling has already begun. The East Germans moved in a huge hydraulic crane, taking off the top of the wall piece by piece. Many have been chipping away with their own tools. In a few hours there'll be a brand new checkpoint. Meanwhile, the party continues. Thousands have been celebrating at the Brandenburg Gate, drinking champagne and setting off fireworks. The bells of freedom ring out over the city, divided no more. Katrina Barnforth, Sky News.
Tens of thousands of East Germans have been trying out their new freedom, flooding through the once impenetrable border. It was the day trip of a lifetime, the chance to reunite families and taste the good life of Western consumerism. Our reporter John Cookson was in East Berlin as the floodgates opened.
The people who, through street protests, had won the right to taste freedom in the West began their journey early. The 26-mile concrete monstrosity called the Berlin Wall was open now. All they had to do was to walk or drive right through. Words like unbelievable, incredible were something you heard a lot of today in East Berlin. No one had, in their wildest dreams, thought these scenes were possible. Less than a week ago, these same people had been penned in by the wall, barbed wire, guard dogs, and automatic firing rifles trained on fleeing refugees. Word had spread like wildfire, and it seemed that the whole of East Berlin dropped what it was doing and headed to the wall.
Throughout the day here in East Berlin, the lines of people waiting to get into the West has been growing on a massive scale. This queue of people behind me stretches for more than half a mile.
Once on the other side, each East Berliner was entitled to a once-a-year payment of 100 West German Deutschmarks. Soon, yet more queues built up at the banks. How were they going to spend it, though? What should they take back for the folks back home? Some headed to electrical shops and fruit stores, others to the kind of shop West Germany is also famous for. Back in the east, the queues grew and grew. Berlin was no longer the divided city. John Cookson, Sky News, East Berlin.
The Soviet Union has also welcomed the changes, but a spokesman made it clear the border still remains, though some might think it's ceased to exist, he said. The start of the reforms behind the Iron Curtain can be traced back to a day in 1985 when the leadership changed in the Soviet Union.
The fact is, none of this would have happened without the vision and the courage of Mr. Gorbachev, who started to enlarge liberty in the Soviet Union, who saw what was happening in Poland and then said, look, so long as you stay in the Warsaw Pact group of countries, yes, rebuild your own democracy. And in Hungary. That is really a visionary man who's known what it was like to live under the old system and wishes better things for his people.
Mrs. Thatcher's tribute to Mikhail Gorbachev has been echoed in both the East and the West. The Soviet president's hand in the radical shake-up of the Eastern Bloc is undeniable. For East Germany, the path to reform began when Gorbachev met the country's former leader, Erich Honecker. On the face of it, the visit was to celebrate East Germany's 40th birthday. But Gorbachev looked uneasy reviewing the troops. It was a military ceremony more akin to Brezhnev than perestroika. Seats were reserved, the ordinary citizens were kept out. Instead, they took to the streets, chanting Gorby Gorby in pro-democracy protests that embarrassed Erich Honecker, the hardliner who had supervised the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The parting of the two leaders turned out to be the kiss of death for the Honecker regime. A month later, his successor Egon Krenz was installed as head of state, and he wasted no time in travelling to Moscow for talks with Gorbachev. Few believed Krenz when he announced that East Germany had much to learn from Kremlin-style reforms. 9 days later, the Berlin Wall is being torn down, free elections have been promised. Since Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union has repeatedly insisted that it won't intervene in the affairs of its East European allies. But the president's lead has already provided a guiding light for Poland and Hungary.
Well, in this morning's programme, I nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize because I think he's had enormous effect on Eastern Europe, on these changes in Eastern Europe, enormous effect outside of Eastern Europe as well, on peace negotiations which are going on, leading to Namibia in Angola. I think peace negotiations in Central America and so on. I think he's had enormous influence. Yes, I really do.
But Gorbachev's visit to China ended disastrously for the demonstrators who greeted his visit. The protests in Tiananmen Square were outside the Great Hall of the People. Embarrassed Chinese leaders had to show the Soviet president in through the back entrance because of the clamour at the front. However, as soon as he'd left, the killings began. And now in East Europe, some politicians are warning it's all happening too quickly. Italy's foreign minister has said we are facing a different kind of risk, a risk from the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc. Adam Harding, Sky News.
In the United States, President Bush has reacted to the historic events of the day by saying they offer us all much hope and deserve our continued encouragement. Mr. Bush has been criticized, however, for his lukewarm response to the events, some accusing him of having no policy to deal with the changes. NBC's John Cochran has the reaction from Washington.
The president's aides admit he seemed too laid back yesterday, mostly because he was caught off guard by the opening of the wall. But White House aides say Bush was genuinely affected by last night's images on TV.
I was moved, as you all were, by the pictures of Berliners from east and west standing atop the wall with chisels and hammers, celebrating the opening of the most vivid symbol of the Iron Curtain.
The president fired back at critics who say his East European policy has been timid. Bush seemed to take partial credit for events in Berlin by pointing to a speech he gave last spring.
And I called upon the Soviet Union to support self-determination for the nations of Eastern and Central Europe and to tear down the Iron Curtain. And now we're seeing it happen.
Still, Bush's critics say he lacks a policy for dealing with rapid changes, such as those in East Germany.
We do not have a constructive design for the future of Europe, and we definitely need one.
French President Francois Mitterrand said France does not fear German reunification, but leaves the decision up to the German people. Although the White House says Bush's upcoming meeting with Gorbachev has no agenda, Bush seemed to say that East Europe is now at the top of it.
The Malta meeting, given recent events, takes on, I think, even more importance than when I conceived the idea 3.5 months ago.
British Ministry of Defence officials have been holding urgent discussions with the West German government, which has requested urgent assistance to deal with the flood of new citizens from the east. The MOD has offered barrack-style accommodation and sites for resettlers in West Berlin. British forces have partitioned off small areas of the city's exhibition complex and provided beds, blankets and mattresses. Mrs. Thatcher spoke to Chancellor Kohl on the phone last night and told him she welcomed the remarkable events in Berlin.
Mrs. Thatcher had warned against change coming too rapidly in a recent interview with Soviet television. But as she stepped out in the rain, the Prime Minister welcomed the dramatic events of the last 24 hours.
I watched the scenes on television last night and again this morning because I felt one ought not only to hear about them, but see them, because you see the joy on people's faces, and you see what freedom means to them. It makes you realize that you can't stifle or suppress people's desire for liberty. And so I watched with the same joy as everyone else, and I hope that there'll be a prelude to the Berlin Wall coming down. I think the whole world has welcomed this as a great day for freedom. We shall, of course, discuss aid at the European community, but I think you would expect that the major portion of aid would come from Germany, which, after all, is a very prosperous country and has an enormous balance of payments surplus with the rest of Europe.
So help in the long term is one priority, but there's also the short-term problem of thousands streaming across the fallen borderline.
Well, the thing they've asked for is that we should make available accommodation. Obviously, the British Army of the Rhine, we have, and in Berlin there's a certain amount of accommodation of different kinds at the disposal of the services. And like the Americans, as the Prime Minister said, we are responding sympathetically to that.
But there's no denying the excitement of these fantastic developments.
They're certainly very exciting, and I think the pace of it all, the pace at which this sort of system in Eastern Europe, based on suppressing people's freedoms, the pace at which that is crumbling, I think, is surprising everybody.
And as we prepare to remember our war dead, Parliament's longest-serving MP, himself a war veteran, says the news is the most dramatic in his 4 decades at the Commons.
It seems to me that what is opening up here is a new era of hope. There will be problems and difficulties, but for the first time, it looks as though it's possible for that all the peoples of Europe, with their common heritage, to come together, to work together, not merely for themselves, but for the wider world beyond.
Neil Kinnock, in Belgium on a visit, says relations between East and West must be reappraised, while some Labour MPs are urging caution.
Because what we're seeing, it could be a mass movement of people and almost a de facto unification of the two Germanys. There's a great deal of movement there in terms of political events that could have and will have profound effects for the whole stability of Europe. And I think that on this occasion, utmost caution from both East and West is obviously the order of the day.
MPs know the extraordinary scenes in Germany will have ramifications that impact on Europe for years. Together with the heads of other Western European states, Britain must now decide on what relationship we develop with East Europe. Richard Bestick, Sky News.
The Berlin Wall has stood as a monument to communism dividing East and West for 28 years. In that time, 200 East Germans have died trying to cross to freedom. Today, the wall is redundant. Berliners are now awaiting the final orders to tear it down almost 3 decades after it was built to divide a city, a country, and separate East from West.
It was Walter Ulbricht, leader of East Germany in August 1961, who ordered the erection of the wall, the barrier where East was divided from West. It went up to stop the flow of people escaping communism. First, the barbed wire was unraveled. At first, Berliners thought it was a temporary measure. They thought it would last a few weeks or months, maybe. But it was followed by the stonemasons. Later came the steel and the armed border guards with orders to shoot to kill. The watchtowers kept a 24-hour vigil looking for escapers. Whole families were divided by it. The frontier in the Cold War. As the years passed by, people kept trying to escape. Some made it, some didn't. Some were more daring than others, as shown by this film when 59 people dug their way to freedom.
Every 6 feet, they planted 2 uprights, and across them a shaped 4x4, which held up the wooden ceiling. This digger, the man with the beard, Hasso Herschel, was a refugee himself. He had fled East Germany after 4.5 years in a communist prison. Now he wrenched the clay out of the tunnel face with a spade, twisting to fill the cart in a space 3 feet by 3 feet, barely roomier than a coffin. In August, the builders of still another tunnel had broken through into a cellar and looked up into the eyes and gun barrels of communist police. Some were killed and some were captured. Death was not the greatest danger. Prison camps can be worse. One of the diggers watched his daughter come through, and then his wife. He had escaped from East Germany the year before. His wife had spent 10 months in a communist prison for trying to follow him, and their second child was born in jail. Tonight, for the first time, he held his baby.
Yes, this wall will fall, for it cannot withstand faith. It cannot withstand truth. The wall cannot withstand freedom.
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. This generation of Germans has earned the right to be free, including the right to unite their families and their nation in lasting peace. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Today, 28 years later, the wall is coming down. The last barrier to freedom in Europe is being demolished. East will mingle with West as the monument to communism finally becomes obsolete.
And even more dramatic changes in the Eastern Bloc this morning. Bulgarian President Todor Zhivkov has stepped down amid mounting pressure for reforms. At age 78, he was the longest-serving communist leader, ruling for 35 years. He's been replaced by 53-year-old Peter Mladenov, the foreign minister. Mladenov has promised reforms, but says they must come within the framework of communism.